Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Ratio Christi live streaming event. I hope all of you are comfy, and thank you again for joining us this evening. I do want to invite all of you at any time to post some questions in the live feed if you have any. So go ahead and post it there. We will address it at the end of our interview this evening if time allows it. So please take the liberty to do that. Now, my name is Daniel Maritz, and I am the Ratio Christi Chapter Director at the University of Pretoria. We have 5 Ratio Christi chapters in South Africa. We have also one in Potchefstroom at the Northwest University. We have one at Rhodes University, Stellenbosch University, and then also the University of KwaZulu-Natal in Pietermaritzburg. Now, Ratio Christi is a students' apologetics ministry where we seek to equip Christian students with historical, philosophical, scientific, and also theological reasons for following Jesus Christ, and also to help them to engage on an effective manner with the big ideas in the culture around them. And so that's what we do. You can also visit our website at www.ratiochristi.co.za. On our website, there's all the information about us that you need. And also, we do publish weekly informative articles on there, which you can also go and read. I can also invite you to download our ebooks on the website. They are for free. And then there's also a recommended book list. And so on our agenda for this evening, our agenda is basically this book. It's titled The Reason for Everything, Exploring the Biggest Questions of Life and Faith, and it's written by Stephen Pohlmann. Now, our guest this evening is Stephen Pohlmann. So, Stephen, I want to just thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking the time to come and talk to us about this book. Is recently published. It's 2021. And Stephen, thank you again for being here. Thanks for taking the time to come and talk with us about your recently published book.
Thank you, Daniel. It's fantastic to see you again, and it's fantastic to be with you tonight.
Yes. I met Stephen earlier this year, and then that's when he gave me a copy of his book. So, Stephen, just to introduce yourself, just take a couple of minutes and tell us about yourself, your family, the ministry where you're involved in, and yes, go for it.
So my name is Stephen Pohlmann, and I live in the south of Johannesburg. What I'm currently doing is I'm leading a church called Riverside Community Church. My wife and I were able to get that church started, plant that church just over 10 years ago. And it's been a really incredible and fruitful experience for us. Before that, I actually qualified as a geologist, and I've always kind of enjoyed the scientific side of life. And my father's actually a pastor, and I never really saw myself going into the ministry. And obviously God had other plans. And yeah, so now I'm living just very close to Alberton, south of Johannesburg. And my wife, it's myself, my wife Bianca, got 2 kids, 9 and 11. Hopefully they're getting into bed round about now, ready for school tomorrow. Yeah, so that's a little bit about me.
Cool. Thanks, Stephen. So I'm gonna go directly to the book, and I'll ask you. I'll just begin with a basic question. So why did you decide to write this book? What was it that motivated you to? I don't know how long you took to write it, but what motivated you to pour your energy into this project?
I would say, for many years, I grew up in a Christian home, and I did the Christian things, and I like to think my faith was still growing at some level. And then I hit a phase where things accelerated somewhat, and part of that was feeling the call to more of a full-time vocational ministry space. But in that kind of upward turn, a very pivotal part of my own growth, as I mentioned before, I've just got a very scientifically wide mind, and I was that irritating kid, always asking why, and I was never easily satisfied, and I'm still not easily satisfied. And I was kind of introduced into the world of apologetics, primarily evidential apologetics. And it really was a new thing for me at that stage. And I found it so exciting, actually, to be able to have that side of my life and my mind invigorated and satisfied, but it's also my faith. Coming out of the geological background, I felt a lot of the answers, a lot of the things that I was exposed to, I could actually go there and I could actually deal with those in a robust way. So formative in my own growth and development. And it kind of became a side hobby. I was just always reading, always watching the YouTube channels, listening to the podcasts, and just growing that side of my understanding. From time to time, preaching about these issues and speaking about these issues. But what actually led to the book was a bit more focused than that, because what I started realizing is there's such a huge gap between most of the material out there and the average person. So what you're getting with me, I haven't studied philosophy. I won't be able to have a coherent conversation with you, Daniel, over many of the subjects that you guys speak about. But that's not where I kind of see the role that I'm playing, the role that this book is playing. Because I would give a William Lane Craig book or some lectures by various apologists to people to listen to, and they just lost interest within seconds. Often because there was just a gap of for those who aren't studying philosophy and engaging in these questions intentionally, these books are just largely inaccessible. And so this book aims to kind of bridge the gap. So it's more like an apologetics 101 or an introductory kind of book to apologetics. So it's not particularly deep, but it is broad, and I think touches on all the major themes, trying to write it in a way that the average matriculant, the average varsity student, not only the philosophy student, but the guy studying, I don't know, psychology or graphic design, the average mom, the average teacher, that's who I had primarily in mind as I wrote this book. And obviously, if it's catches them and if they feel compelled to go deeper, then I can always move them on to much better books. But as far as books occupying this kind of niche, I don't think there are too many of those out there. So yeah, that was the reason behind writing this book. Yeah.
Yes, no, thanks, Stephen. What I like about, that's exactly what I like about this book, is that it's so accessible, that it's so, I mean, anyone in church can take this book and use it as a textbook for small kids, high school kids, and then even university students who's just about getting into something like apologetics and asking some of these questions. So I think that's what I like about this book, is that it's so accessible, and I really hope that that many churches will actually make use of this book, and the purpose that you have for writing it. I mean, you know, to reach, to provide that stepping stone into the world of apologetics. I think that's very good. So thanks for your work here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Now, I thought, Stephen, maybe we can just go through some of the, you know, just to, I want in our discussion now to sort of give an overview of this book. So maybe you can maybe start us off with just, I see the first chapter, what happened at the beginning, and maybe you can just, I know what that's, I mean, I've read portions of the book already, and I know what's it about, but for the listeners out there who I think will benefit from this book, maybe you can, for the rest of our discussion, we can go through the book. And so let's start with chapter 1, and then you can maybe just tell us what's the main thrust, what's the biggest questions that chapter seeks to answer. And yeah, you can go for it.
Well, I think to even take one step backwards is to kind of appreciate the bigger macro flow of the book, and that is to start at a very general perspective. And so right from the outset, if you read chapter 1 and you become convinced that chapter 1 holds water and is convincing, I'm really arguing for a creator. And that could be, in essence, any theistic being that is a creator type God of sorts. So I'm not arguing specifically for Jesus Christ. And as I move through the book, I kind of try and narrow the funnel towards not just theism, the idea that there's maybe a God out there, but towards the God of the Bible, and then ultimately towards God as we know him in and through Jesus Christ. And then getting to the end of the book, which is also, I think, where maybe this book is a bit unique, to ask and answer the question, what is the gospel? And I'm sure most of your listeners are aware of this, but when we're talking about apologetics, we're talking about a lot of evidence-based argumentation, and we're trying to connect bridges with the world of science and the world of philosophy and psychology, and so draw people into this worldview that we think is coherent and make sense of all of life. But ending with chapter 11, kind of putting that methodology aside and just allowing the Bible to just speak without needing to defend that, because you kind of did that in earlier chapters. So the book's kind of like a funnel, ultimately getting to the point where if you've made it to the end of, if you made it this far in the book, now let me just tell you how the Bible explains salvation and issues of the gospel. So starting at chapter 1, my goal isn't to convince you necessarily about who Jesus is or any of those more narrow ideas, but really that just general observation and general agreement within the scientific world should lead us to conclude that there is a creator behind what we see around us. Really, just from a number of angles, I think the first one I speak through is arguing that if space and time has a beginning, which was actually a novel concept until, was a novel concept only in relative recent history, has science kind of got into the point. And by when I say recent, I mean Einstein level history, where the world was rocked with the understanding that, wow, the universe has a beginning. And of course, the question is, well, how did that arrive? I mean, every cause needs to have, every effect needs a cause. And therefore, if we've got this huge effect, what is this cause? Which is by definition, a metaphysical cause to a physical effect, or a supernatural cause to a natural effect, this universe. So that's one of the arguments that I try and develop. And just by the way, that's really why I've chosen this picture of the telescope. Is I tell the story in the book, in this chapter, just as a kid, how I was exposed to this really old school, beautiful laboratory, not a laboratory, where does this escape my mind now? Planetarium, that's it. And just searching the planets and the stars in a really wonderful, whimsical way. And so, yeah, so that's kind of the first argument that I take, and really, without necessarily calling it this, but I think some of you more familiar with apologetics would recognize the design arguments, and looking at kind of macro issues, meaning I kind of talk about, you look through the telescope and what do we learn about the design of the universe and some of the elements that need to be so finely tuned in order for us to exist. And then going almost to the subcellular level, and what are some of the design elements we see there that really the only explanation for some of that stuff is the reality of there being a God, an intelligent being that started all of this.
Yes, good. Thanks, Stephen. Yes, I think I like the first chapter, and I also appreciate the funnel that you talked about, the structure of the book. You know, you're taking us somewhere, and I think that's good. Yeah. So in the first chapter, basically, you're arguing for the existence of God, but not necessarily the Christian God. It's just this, like you said, this, this metaphysical being who caused everything that exists.
Correct.
And I see then, if we can go on, unless you want to still point out something in that chapter, but I see then in the next chapter, you especially tackle the much debated topic of religion versus science. And I know someone like John Lennox has spent a great deal of time on that topic as well. But it's especially as with the the secular worldview started to flourish at universities and so on. This idea that you can't really reconcile faith with science became very prevalent, and it's still really something that we must engage with. So maybe you can expand on that chapter as well.
Yeah, look, I think if I could take it from two angles, and the one is an angle that I think we are to blame for, and by we I mean the general Christian community, at least partly to blame, and that is, well, maybe there's two sides to that, and the one side is that unfortunately many have adopted an anti-science philosophy to their religion. Maybe they wouldn't use those words, but science is almost seen as the enemy, because, and I understand, maybe they're afraid of some of the assumptions that science, or even some of the conclusions that science comes to, and so maybe they're afraid of, for example, evolution, and evolution and science go hand in hand, so therefore we can't go there, just in case we all become evolutionists kind of thing. And so there's maybe an anti-science and throwing out the baby in the bathwater kind of approach taken there. I think the other thing that has made this dialogue very difficult is the way sometimes Christians have come to understand what faith is. And I mean this at almost a low level, kind of a popular, just what's being consumed by the millions out there. Faith is very often characterized as this, we'll use the term, a leap of faith. Kind of, I don't know what's out there. I'm going to stand here, and if I am a Christian, I need to jump into this like void, hoping that all this stuff is true. And if I do that, that's my faith. And unfortunately, while that's a very popular kind of caricature of faith, that's definitely not the way the Bible describes faith at all. Yes, there is always going to be a leap in a sense, but it's not a leap into I wonder. There is a sense of evidence of who God is, who Jesus is, and faith is me now choosing to place my trust in this person or this worldview, and to start allowing myself to be reformed by, in our particular case, by Jesus and his teachings. And so the act of faith is not me hoping that Jesus is real, but because I know that Jesus is real, I choose to trust him with all of my life. And so how faith gets kind of bandied about and in bad memes and just bad social media activity, it really does seem to create this false impression that that kind of faith is anti-science. And I would agree, but this kind of faith I don't believe is coherent, and I don't think it accords well with how the Bible describes faith. And for that reason, we just give those who do believe and trust in science a lot of ammo, but unfortunately it is a straw man, because this doesn't exist. So a lot of the dialogue and the kind of hostility between faith and science is a false dichotomy that I don't think needs to exist. And so I failed to mention this earlier. While I did try to write my book with the seeker or the skeptic or the non-believer in mind, if you had to put a gun to my head, I'd say I probably more had the Christian in mind who's wanting to equip themselves and find themselves at this entry level of this world of being able to defend your faith. And so even in the dialogue around faith and science, not only am I trying to convince the skeptic that faith is not anti-science. In fact, I believe good theology and good science should accord well. I think we've got a rational God who designed this universe rationally and coherently, and therefore we do not need to be afraid of it. And so if there is a contradiction, it's either going to be bad theology or bad science. And sometimes a good discussion will clear that up, or sometimes a couple of 100 years will clear that up. But not only am I trying to convince the skeptic that faith is not anti-science, at least faith the way the Bible describes it, I feel like I'm also trying to help the Christian understand that and help them mature in their understanding of what faith actually is. And if you get that, then you can realize how we don't have to see science as the boogeyman.
Yes, and I think a part of this is also, as Christians, we also believe that God revealed himself in nature and in scripture. And so I think if that's the case, then there won't be a contradiction between the two as well. Correct. And so that should, as you said, that should encourage us, therefore Christians should be encouraged by that to pursue science as well, and to be on top of that. Yes. To study it if they at all want to. They shouldn't be scared of that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And by science, I guess I did focus on more natural sciences, but I think I would include some of the other sciences, kind of the so-called soft sciences out there, like psychology or philosophy. I mean, if we've got a rational God who has made an ordered rational world, and kind of rationality is part of our maturity as human beings, and then how the mind works and how we are to think clearly about life and all the different aspects of life, both the material world as well as the non-material world, which, by the way, is why I called my book The Reason for Everything, is because, you can pull up some arguments and it feels like a bit of a gotcha moment, against the Christians. Look, we've got a coherent argument for the existence of God. I'm like, okay, fine, I'll give you that. But can you explain all things? Can you explain kind of the hopes and dreams of humanity? Can you explain our experience of suffering and death? Can you explain why people who don't believe in God are mourning at a funeral and saying things like Granny's in a better place? I mean, just even if you don't believe that, why are you saying that? So what is the impulse in the human heart to even go there? And so can your worldview address all things and not just one or two things well?
Yes, yes, that's very important. And I think that leads us into the next chapter on human dignity, right? How do you have this chapter here on human dignity. Let me just get the title here. I just had it and now I lost it again. But in any case, you've got this chapter here, which is, and I think it ties in with what you just mentioned, that as Christians we also look at human beings and the human nature, and we confess certain things about humanity. What a human is, and and it's again, we can ground this in many places, but we also ground this in the idea that God created man in his image. So
Yeah.
maybe we can dive into that chapter then.
I mean, I think this is so important in our current time that we live in, and I'm referring to our global time, where just the idea of human dignity and human rights and equality, be it racial equality or gender equality, whatever the case might be, has become, yes, loaded, but also people are rightly wanting to fight for the rights of those who have not experienced the dignity of what it means to be human in a full sense. And largely, it is largely a secular driven narrative, not that they've got the full monopoly on that idea. And my question is, but where does that come from? Because if we are just a product of blind processes that we just happen to get here, there is no qualitative difference between my value and the value of anything, any other living being or thing out there. And not just the things and the beings we like to protect, like the polar bears or I don't know, the white rhinos, but cockroaches and rodents infesting our house. There is no more dignity that I have than them. And if anything, the natural world is a world that is actually ruled by violence, and a world that is ruled by, yes, Darwin said, nature is red in tooth and claw. You just recently we went to a game park, and one of the highlights of anyone's game park is to see a lion kill, and we all pull out our cameras. But if we see a human kill, we all want to throw up. And by we all, I don't just mean religious people, non-religious people want to throw up. And my question is, why? Where does that come from? And so I think there's a dignity and a value that is assumed by almost everyone, at least in modern eras. And our worldview there needs to be an explanatory power to that. That's not just assumed. The other side that I think is difficult to explain by purely naturalistic processes is, on one hand, why do humans have such dignity and beauty and power, and why they're capable of such incredible things, and not just feats of strength, but things of beauty, things of creativity. And how do we explain that? And how do we explain the fact that humans are we're always messing ourselves up? And any human system, whether it's a political system or an economic system, gets messed up, not because the system's necessarily bad, but because we're bad. And whether we're thinking about the Hitlers of the world, or whether we're just thinking about the fact that my wife and I just had a big fat argument, or I never got the job, or I made some other mess up, kind of got angry with someone while driving today, and I really shouldn't have lost my cool with that guy. Why do we do that? I don't see my dog showing regrets when she's a bad dog, and so there's this fallibility about humanity. There's this frailty that is just plain. You cannot ignore that. And at the same time, there's this greatness, there's this beauty about humanity that we want to preserve. And even, by the way, in not only those who are great and those who are accomplished and those who are beautiful, but we want to preserve, we want to fight for the rights of those who don't have those things. We want to fight for the rights of the voiceless. We want to fight for the rights of the weak. We want to fight for the rights of those who do not have power and lots of wealth, etc. And again, where does that impulse come from? And I don't think a naturalistic view comes close to giving us a satisfactory reason for that impulse. And I think the fact that we are created in God's image is really the only worldview that explains that. and the fact that we have fallen somewhat from that image. And that's, I mean, the Bible would call it sin, whether you refer to general capital S sin and the fallenness and brokenness of creation, or sins, the things that I do wrong. I know it's not a popular word in the secular world, but regardless of what you call it, I think it explains what we see and what we experience better than any worldview out there.
Yes, no, that's good. If you can, Stephen, maybe you can. There's this one section in that chapter where with the heading, "The cross is the greatest demonstration of human value." And I'm wondering, maybe you can just give us a glimpse of what you wrote there.
So there's basically, I don't think I used this language necessarily, but I think categorically there's a difference between inherent value and ascribed value. And inherent value would be, a gold bar. It's inherently valuable. Ascribed value is the value I give something. And so a memento, or something that maybe costs a few rand, but because I got it from my great grand, it's something of great value. And so there's a way of determining the value of something by what someone is willing to pay for that thing. So I told a story about a guy who discovered this baseball in his family's history, and it happened to be a baseball that Babe Ruth hits at his first big game, and this value the ball turned out to be worth tens of millions of dollars. Similarly, I, as you guys can see, I'm a musician as well. And if you had to go buy a brand new Fender Stratocaster, I don't know, depending on the guitar, you'll pay anything from 20 to 50,000 rand. But someone will be willing to pay several $1 million for a guitar played by Jimi Hendrix. Now, the actual guitar, there's no difference in the guitar, but because someone is willing to pay that amount of money, there's a value now ascribed to the guitar. And so if we look at humanity, and again, not just accomplished humanity, but frail, broken humanity, the fact that God would be willing to pay the highest price for us is a way of ascribing value to something. It's not a dollar price or a rand price, it's the price of his son. And as much as we might come to an understanding of what would it mean for someone to lay their life down for someone, we need to multiply that by a factor of infinity to even recognize what does it mean for God to willingly lay his life down for, again, not the awesome humanity out there, but the broken, frail, troubled humanity. And in doing that, he ascribed the highest level of dignity to us as a people. And for me, the cross is the highest picture of human dignity out there.
Yes, thanks, Stephen. Now I think I think it was really a wise of you to address that chapter of human dignity, and also answering the question why the world is so messed up because of the brokenness of humanity as well. Now, I do, however, want to go on with this one. Why is the church filled with hypocrites? And I thought that's an interesting one you've decided to add to your book, and I just want to hear some of your thoughts there.
So, again, for those of you who've kind of journeyed in the world of apologetics, this definitely doesn't fall into the category of anything that you've studied anywhere before. However, again, my impulse is to help Christians and to help skeptics overcome some of the biggest obstacles to faith. And there's no doubt apologetics will largely deal with more cognitive, intellectual obstacles to faith. But you get, I mean, you alluded to it earlier, Daniel, the chapter on suffering and evil. While there is a cognitive, intellectual way of unpacking that, and I think in a very intellectually satisfying way, the problem with that chapter is that people aren't arguing primarily from an intellectual perspective, but from an emotional perspective, because we find evil so horrifying. And especially if one has witnessed or experienced suffering. And so kind of opens up the gates for also dealing with some of the emotional objections to Christianity. And I think the chapter on hypocrisy is less of an intellectual challenge, but an emotional challenge. I'm reading a book at the moment called The Anatomy of Deconversion, where this guy, John Marriott, is just studying this exodus of faith at the moment, and how one of the biggest contributing factors to so many people leaving the faith, there are some intellectual factors there as well, but the biggest emotional one is that of hypocrisy. Being ill-treated by Christians or church leaders, or by, experiencing some of the kind of horror sometimes where church leaders have been doing horrible things, kind of sexual failures or financial failures, whatever the case might be. And that has devastating effects on people around them. And so there's a big emotional repulsion. This faith that we say is so full of love and grace. And I think there's this understanding that Christianity should make us better people, which on one hand is false, but on the other hand is true. Kind of people say, oh, I don't see anything real in you, and in fact I'm being repulsed by you, and that happens more and more. And yes, people are going to our lives are going to turn people off, and so I think we as Christians need to own that from two angles. The one angle is, yes, we have far too regularly been judgmental, and we have far too regularly been unloving, and we haven't been Christ in the way Christ was to the world. And so that's the one side, is just for us to own that. The other side is for both Christians and skeptics to recognize that Christianity at its heart is not about bad people becoming good people. At its heart, it's about sinful people that I spoke about earlier, or broken, frail humanity being demonstrably unable to do anything about it, and demonstrably unable to do anything about death ultimately, and Jesus claiming to do something about both. And the way I access the gift of what he has done is through my faith, my trust in what he actually did in history and has cosmically done for us. That's what it's about, which means the broken human who is frail and is messed up is called to trust Jesus. And therefore, if the gospel is working, and that means if broken people are coming to Jesus for the reason he came, then yeah, we're going to see a whole lot of people on a journey of sorts. And the journey is by no means linear. The journey is up and down and backwards, and 3 steps forward, 2 steps backward, and then accelerated, and then I doubt, and then I struggle, and then I grow, and then I go forward. And that's what the journey is like. So, and so it's really to, yes, understand that while we do want to see Christians mature, and we do want to see Christians represent Christ well in this world, that's an outcome of faith. That's not the heart of faith. And so if Christianity is working, it means we're going to see a whole lot of messed up people finding new life and faith in Christ and figuring that out. And then the last thing I try and just drive home at some point is the fact that hypocrisy isn't only for that pastor who had some affairs, or that other pastor who stole a whole lot of money from the church budgets, but it's actually all of us. that every person, not only every Christian, but every person fails to live up to their own standard of morality. So even if I let you define what you think morality ought to be, it doesn't matter who you are in the planets, you don't live up to that. In fact, probably not a day goes by where you don't live up to that. In other words, at some level, every single one of us are hypocrites. Now, that's not to let ourselves off the hook, but it is a perspective-giving thought, both for Christians and for those who are maybe quite hurt by some of the hypocrisy that they've seen.
Yes, that's a good That's a good input. That last thought that you just talked about, I think it's a good one. I do just want to ask you one practical question about this, and we don't have to spend too much time here because I want to move on to the next chapter. But how do you think, if someone makes this objection about the church being full of hypocrites and therefore Christianity is not for him or her? So how, what's the best way to just talk to someone like that, someone with that kind of objection?
Look, I think the spirit with which we respond is going to be the deal breaker there. And so if we get all defensive, and even if you use the very argument in this book, but it's done with a defensive spirit and a proud spirit, well, maybe you've gained some intellectual ground, but you've lost the battle, kind of thing. And so I think the spirit of humility is probably going to be your best friend in that time. And there could be any starting point, but I would definitely say, man, that you humble yourself, and probably the best part of starting point is something along the lines of, you're right. I mean, I'm a pastor, which by definition means I'm a church leader, which means I'm exposed to everyone's hypocrisy, including my own. And so for me to kind of get angry about this line of inquiry, I'd say is hypocritical. But if I can say, you're right, I mean, I'm definitely not representing Christ well in this world all the time. I try to, but I don't always get it right. I've been hurt in the church. Don't have to air my dirty laundry, but I've also been hurt. And so I'd say that's probably the best starting point. And then maybe to go into some of the, just the nature of the gospel, which is not a moralistic, therapeutic, deistic idea. And then this whole idea that, but we're all hypocrites. But again, I think tone is so important. If I'm saying, oh, but you're also hypocrites, now I'm coming across judgmentally, as opposed to, listen, I am a hypocrite, and just gently helping this person see that they also fail to live to their own moral standards. But definitely tone matters. It matters most, I think, in every chapter of discussion or any line of inquiry, but especially here because of the emotive nature of this particular chapter.
Yes, and I think then in the long run, as you basically said this, then we can at some point try to let someone see that there's a difference between a Christian like myself, who have my moments of hypocrisy, and Christianity, right? Which is the gospel. And so if we can help them see that distinction, then I think it's good.
And then, sorry, the final thing, which I think is imperative, is even if all of their concerns about Christians is true, I mean, at the heart of our faith is a person, Jesus, not Stephen Pohlmann. And almost, yes, let's acknowledge the failures of Christianity, but at the same time, it's actually about Christ and his perfection. And in fact, that is the gospel. It was his perfection, him living the life that we could not live, that is at the heart of the gospel. So, yeah.
Okay, so now the next chapter is a very explosive, is another, I think it's in our times, in our day and age now, this has become the major topic of discussion, and it's about sex and gender. And the title of your chapter is "How Do Sex and Gender Matter?" And so, I really, that's another thing that I appreciated about this book, is that you actually have a chapter on that issue, because it has become such a big topic. It's become many people struggle with this, and I think it's very important for the church as a whole to really give clear and good guidance when it comes to this subject. So maybe um, you can ask the question that you state there or you can answer the question that you state there in the title. How does it matter?
Look, I started writing this book just over 2 years ago, probably closing in on about 3 years ago. And it was already a topic of division and dissension. But it's just multiplied exponentially since then. I don't know if I would write the chapter any differently if I wrote it today. But I'm just, as you say, Daniel, it has become, it's probably become the space of hostility between sort of historic Christianity and where things are, at least in the progressive world today. And for that reason, it makes dialogue very difficult, because once again, it's a highly emotive topic, and we don't see a lot of just good conversation and dialogue modeled for us. So, but at the end of the day, as Christians, we can either stay in our holy huddles and just affirm everything that we believe to one another and kind of ignore all the, like, and I say this in inverted commas, all the evil out there. And I just don't think that's a great posture. I think even if we are convinced of a biblical view of sex and gender, we still need to be given some tools for how to engage the conversation, because maybe the average person who gets hold of my book is not going to interface with an angry student at university around this topic, but I can guarantee you the kids will. I can guarantee you someone's going to come along, their neighbor, and say, "Oh, you're a Christian. Oh, that means you hate homosexuals." And at some point, the topic's going to find them, even if they're not looking for the conversation. And so, how do we? I talk in this chapter about how the book of John talks about how Jesus came full of grace and truth. And how can I graciously engage such an emotive topic and still hold fast to the biblical truths of sex and gender, which is not easy, but I think it's worth trying and worth fighting for. So on one hand, I do try to give a biblical rationale for primarily a binary view of sex and gender. The Bible does address both dynamics of this conversation. But at the same time, the Bible also is filled with people who don't conform to what God's perfect plan for sex and gender is. And I don't just mean the spectrum of gender identity. I include, Matthew 19 talks about eunuchs and those who were either born eunuchs, so there's some form of intersex something happening there, or those who castrate themselves for the sake of the kingdom Jesus talks about, or whether it's someone who's committed adultery and is looking for some form of atonement, or whether it's the single mom who walks into church hanging her head in shame and just feels like everyone's judging her because she's got divorced, or whatever the case might be. And so all of these are similar in the sense of they fall outside of biblical norms. We need to learn how to deal with those graciously and with the gospel, primarily, before we just stand on our tomato box screaming how we're more right than you kind of thing. I mean, it was modeled mostly by Jesus in John 8, who the woman caught in adultery. Sure, it's not an intersex trans issue, but it's someone who fell outside of the biblical standards of what biblical sex and sexuality is all about. And if anything, the Pharisees who wanted to stone her had the right Bible verses in place. And Jesus was able to, on one hand, skillfully address their own hypocrisy and lack of grace. And while he didn't just kind of fudge the truth and say, oh, whatever, go and do what your truth is, he still dealt with her fallenness and her sin at that stage, but he actually dealt with her graciously first. His first response was, where are those who condemn you? Oh, I see they're gone. Well, neither do I condemn you. Now go and sin no more. And so I think the order is imperfect. Grace then truth, grace then truth. And I think that modeled by Christ is probably the best way that we can try and model how we dialogue these issues. We will never be immune to mud being flung at us and just the natural difficulty of the conversation at the moment. But if we are going to be having the conversation, I think that's how we need to be doing it.
Yes, and I think the problem that I'm seeing is that people think that they have to choose between the two. They have to choose either you're going to be graceful and compromise on truth, or just change truth, if that's, change truth.
Yeah.
Or you choose for truth and you can't have grace with that. Well, I think what's good is here is you bring it's not as if it's a dilemma. We have to pick one. Right? We can have both. We can be greedy here and have both of them, and be graceful with people who are really having a tough time making sense of their gender identity and so on.
Correct.
But also confront them with truth.
Yeah. And also, and I think this is where I really try and wrap things up in that part of the chapter, is the fact that, I mean, we as Christians at least know this in other areas of our lives. I don't go from being an evil person, I become a Christian, and all of a sudden I'm a perfect person. Man, I become a Christian, and that's page 1 now of my new kind of life, my new book. And God's going to deal with all aspects of me throughout the next 50, 60, 70 years of my existence. And he's going to deal with me he's going to deal with my temperament. He's going to deal with my thought life. He's going to deal with my language. He's going to deal with some of the concepts and the kind of the structure that occupies my mind. He's going to deal with my sexuality. He's going to deal with everyone's sexuality, not just those who struggle with it. But he's going to deal with everyone's sexuality, and everyone's going to be challenged with an aspect of that which is going to be uncomfortable or go against at least some sort of natural, what feels at least a natural inclination of sorts. And to also allow the story to unfold in people's lives and not to dive straight into confronting in a more combative way, where kind of our first conversation is the issue on sex and gender. It's a conversation that at some stage God will address in people's lives in the same way that he'll address it in my life. But God doesn't pile everything in on day one.
Yes. No, that's good. All right. And now the last couple of chapters of the book was then especially the historical side of Christianity. And I think I think it was Gresham Machen, he's famous for that book, Christianity and Liberalism, who basically said, in one sense, Christianity is an event, referring to the resurrection of Christ. But before we get there, the first chapter that you start with is, can we trust the Bible? And I mean, that has to do with historical investigations, archaeology, textual criticism and so many aspects. And I mean, we definitely cannot cover all of it here, but if you can maybe, just give us a very brief rundown of the chapter, that would be good.
Look, I think the main angle that I try and do here, and this kind of chapter is going to be in almost every apologetics book out there, but again, trying to write it in a way that the person who's being exposed to this kind of thinking for the first time can actually kind of metabolize for themselves, is really to ask and answer the question, is the Bible historically reliable? And what we primarily mean by that is, and just to understand what is being claimed by this argument and what is not being claimed by this argument. What this chapter doesn't argue for necessarily is that the scripture is the inerrant word of God, and that there's some sort of inherent power in the word as we have it. I mean, I believe that, but that's almost a consequential set of discussions that need to be had. What I'm arguing for is, does the text that as we have it today, granted it's been translated, but that we have access to, how reliable is it in terms of, on one hand, has it changed much from, I mean, even non-Christians kind of probably realize at some point we think Moses wrote some of the Bible, and this guy that Christians always talk about called Paul, we think he wrote some of the Bible, and they've heard about Peter who walked on water, and he wrote some of the Bible. So Peter wrote some stuff down, and we've got something now 2,000 and a bit years later, or in some cases 3,000 and a bit years later. A very common claim is there's no way what we've got is anything close to what they wrote, even if they did write stuff down a couple of thousand years ago. And there's actually very well worn paths of discovering the truth of those claims, one way or the other, and not only in religious texts, but in all texts. And if you apply the kind of tests that people use to determine the reliability, the historical reliability of the text that we have today compared to what is potentially written down by Herodotus, by Caesar's Gallic Wars, Josephus, whoever, if we apply the same test to the Bible comes out way ahead of the game. It's not even comparable. It is literally the most reliable historic ancient document that we have. There's just no two ways about it. Again, that doesn't argue that what it says is objectively true, but that line of reasoning proves that it's historically reliable in the sense that we have access to what was written down by the original authors. The second line of reasoning is to start to argue for the historic truthfulness of the Bible, not just its accuracy. And so, yes, looking at some of the archaeological claims for large portions, people were upset that the Bible, there was no archaeological evidence for Pontius Pilate, until the 60s. And then we found the archaeological evidence for Pontius Pilate. And that's just one example of dozens of, we got the Christians because there's no evidence that Tyre and Sidon existed. Oh, wait, okay, we found evidence that Tyre and Sidon existed. And I mean, I only listed a handful. There are probably hundreds of occasions where this has happened. And so archaeologically, the Bible lines up with what is being discovered. Prophetically, just the fact that there are certain scriptures that can be demonstrated were written prior to certain events that came true, and most pointedly in the person of Christ. And statistically, for the scriptures pertaining to the coming Messiah to have accidentally or naturally come true, I'm not going to get into the kinds of numbers we need, statistical numbers we refer to. It's impossible for that to happen. It's statistically impossible. And yet they all came true in Christ. And so it warrants some explanation. And I'm just trying to think I suppose I tell the stories of a couple of archaeologists who became convinced because of their studies in archaeology of the truth of Scripture, and ultimately became Christians because they just saw the evidence. And this is so important because, again, the Bible is probably one of the first places skeptics or YouTube atheists or whatever go to in order to discredit Christianity. Because if we can get rid of your book, we get rid of everything else. And so again, I'm not thinking about your philosophy students. I'm thinking your average matriculants who gets confronted, but there's a contradiction in your New Testament, and they bring out whatever contradiction they saw on Reddit that day. Immediately the student goes, oh no, my whole faith falls apart. And it's like, actually, no. Let's equip you to think more robustly around the nature of the Scriptures, and that there are ways to navigate these so-called apparent contradictions or whatever claims that are being thrown out, whatever flavor the claims are on that particular day. Yeah,
that's good. I think what I also heard you saying now was that the Bible, certain events in history, like, for example, the Bible is true because it corresponds to reality, right? Because the propositions that we read in the Bible refers to actual historical events and spiritual truths as well. Like, for example, when the Bible talks about the fallenness of humanity, it's because we are really fallen. When the Bible confronts me with my sin, or when I'm confronted with sin and the Bible says I'm a sinner, I'm really a sinner, so there's a claim to reality itself. That's why the Bible is true. And I think that's the important thing that I think we should emphasize.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Okay, now I think we can end with this last one, which is one I refer to now, the resurrection of Jesus. And if we were to make a list of the essentials of Christianity, what is it that defines Christianity, then you can't make a list without the resurrection of Jesus. And so I think it's good that you end with that in one way. Maybe you can talk about the resurrection of Jesus, and then we'll end with the last one on the gospel.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the resurrection is the most essential element of our faith. I think there are things that I hold to be very dear and to be very important and are closed-handed issues for me that some people might disagree with me who call themselves Christians and are probably Christians. But the resurrection is the kind of like the final rung on the ladder. If the resurrection is not true, everything else falls apart. Which is also why it does get a lot of attention, both by Christians and by skeptics or atheists in debates, because they know that if we can get rid of the resurrection, we get rid of the heart of Christianity. And so really what I try and demonstrate is that the resurrection is historically accessible. Not by, people want evidence, and I think what people unrealistically mean by that is like, prove to me that God exists, or in this case, prove to me that the resurrection happened. And the kind of demands they put on that proof are demands that they don't use for all other proof in life. So when someone's found not guilty in courts, it's not always because they've got 40 credible eyewitnesses and someone filmed the event with an iPhone and such and such and such and such. It's often argumentation and based on evidence and eyewitnesses that eventually you can conclude this event happened or it didn't happen. And so we work with evidence all the time. We don't always work with proof. And so, no one was there with an iPhone recording the resurrection of Jesus. I can't prove it to you in that way, but I can provide extremely compelling evidence that he arose, including eyewitness accounts and again, just because I claim I saw the tooth fairy doesn't mean I saw the tooth fairy. But as we push the eyewitness accounts, we see a coherency, we see high levels of agreement, we see the eyewitnesses being willing to die for their faith. Now, I'll never die for the tooth fairy, but I'll be willing to die for something that is true and for something that is of eternal value. I mean, there's so many. The fact that the Bible records that women were the first to see the resurrection. Now, the feminists of today were like, well, of course, well, that's fine. But back then, whether you talk about Jewish culture or even Roman culture, a woman's testimony was not valid. So if I was going to invent evidence in the first century for Jesus' resurrection, I wouldn't put women there. Now, I'm not a misogynist. I'm just going, put your head into first century culture. That's your worst argument. And the only reason you do that is if they were the first people to see the risen Jesus. That's, if you're making up your faith, you don't include, you don't die for that. If you're making something up, you don't include women as the first eyewitness accounts. You don't, I mean, the eyewitnesses are mentioned by name, and at the time of writing, these eyewitnesses would have been alive. So it's not like a book 300 years after the Holocaust arguing that the Holocaust never existed. It's like there's still survivors out there. You can go ask my grand, she was there, whatever the case might be. And in the same way, those receiving the Bible, the letters for the first time in that time, they could have gone and asked the people who were mentioned by name and interrogated them. And that's just a small handful of some of the lines of reasoning there. But it is just very compelling, extremely compelling, the evidence for the reality of the resurrection, including how some of the, some might claim that the apostles lied about it. And again, I don't think that you don't die for a lie. You die for something that is true, or at least something that you believe to be true. Others would claim that, or maybe they hallucinated, and there have been mentions of someone's grandfather passing away and having some form of vision of the grandfather. But what's never, ever, ever happened is more than one person having the same hallucination or the same vision. And here you've got over 500 people seeing Christ, and separated by time. And so some of the refutations that come out against the resurrection don't hold water like they claim to. And so I think the historical reality of Christ's resurrection is the best explanation of the evidence.
I always like reading Acts 26, and just that phrase of Paul when he talks about the resurrection, because it's true and reasonable. I'm speaking true and reasonable words because it was not done in a corner. The resurrection, it wasn't an event, a private thing. It was a public thing. People talked about, people, like you said, eyewitness testimonies. And so it's sort of, and then Paul, of course, 1 Corinthians 15, naming the eyewitnesses, inviting you to, like you said, inviting you to go and talk to them. I think that's, and that's part of the historical method, how we deal with historical events, So it's not as if it's part of how you deal with historical data.
Exactly. This is not only a Christian way of defending this historical event, and it's not only a religious way of doing things. It is literally how people try and determine what happened in history. And so we're letting the same rules apply to us. And I think the evidence is very compelling.
Well, Stephen, I think we're at the end of the book now. And now I want to encourage our listeners to please go and buy this book. And especially if you are new to apologetics, this is probably one of the best books out there to serve as that, as I've said earlier, to serve as that stepping stone into the world of apologetics. But Stephen, maybe you can just tell us where we can, if someone's interested in buying the book, just tell us where, and also we will put some of these links, if it's not already there, but we will put these links that you're going to talk about now also in the description of this video on YouTube.
So if I can kind of hold this up, if we look at the spelling of my name there, the name of my website is stephenpohlmann.com, and I've just got an online shop there, and I can deliver all over South Africa. It's kind of one of those things, the more books you buy, the cheaper per unit it gets. So this, and I don't say this exclusively as a sales pitch, but I do sincerely believe this is the kind of book you buy, one for yourself and three for your friends kind of thing, because again, it's the book that introduces the skeptic to Christianity. There are, for more advanced arguments, there are way better books out there, but as a kind of first step, I think this book is quite unique. So if you go into stephenpohlmann.com, you can order there. And if you go into Amazon, you can download onto Kindle from Amazon. And yeah, those are where you can find the book.
Cool. What I'm going to do is on our website, we have a recommended book list. And so I'll just go and add Stephen Pohlmann's book to that list. So you'll also be able to find it on the Ratio Christi website at resources recommended books. I will also add it there in the next couple of days.
Thank you.
Stephen, thank you so much again for joining us. It's been a delight talking to you, and it's been a pleasure to get to know you as well this last couple of months. I mean, like I said, I only met you at the beginning of the year, but I'll be praying for you and your church and the ministry endeavors and all the attempts that you guys are busy with at participating in God's kingdom, and all the best of God's providence to you and your family as well.
Well, thank you, Daniel. Thank you for the opportunity, and and thank you to all of those who logged in and are listening to this, and really hope that everyone got something to take away with them today.
Cool. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. And then we'll see you at our next online event. Have a great evening further.
Thank you.